as a prelude to the Japanese midget submarine attacks on Sydney Harbour on 31st of May 1942, Flight Officer Nobuo Fujita completed a reconnaissance flight in his Glenn floatplane over Sydney Harbour from Submarine I-25. This happened on 17th of February 1942. Incredibly, no one noticed that this Japanese floatplane flying over Sydney was an enemy aircraft. Meiji Tagami, the commander of Submarine I-25, then sailed southwards on their next mission, a similar reconnaissance flight over Melbourne. Commander Tagami decided to launch the aircraft from Cape Wickham at the northern end of King Island. Before he launched the floatplane near Cape Wickham, Tagami made a submerged daylight trip across Bass Strait to Cape Otway. He made a number of periscope inspections of the southwest Victorian coastline when he was about 10 miles offshore. Tagami travelled back to Cape Wickham submerged. He waited in sight at the northern end of King Island for a few days for conditions suitable to launch the aircraft. Nobuo Fujita and Soji Okuda were ready for their flight over Melbourne. They could still see the beam of the unmanned Cape Wickham lighthouse in the distance through light fog. Submarine I-25 moved forward to help launch the floatplane. They were in the air about 2 hours before dawn on 26 February 1942. Fujita flew north across Bass Strait, headed for Cape Otway, where he banked to the northeast and followed the coastline to Point Lonsdale, near the narrow entrance to Port Phillip Bay. He then headed northeast towards the city of Melbourne. He continued to encounter heavy cloud and was unsure of his position. He eventually dropped down from 1,500 metres to 300 metres. At about 6:45 a.m, Fujita cleared the base of the clouds. He had exited the clouds directly above RAAF's Laverton airfield. Royal Australian Air Force personnel at Laverton reported sighting the Japanese aircraft. 2 Wirraway fighters were scrambled to try to locate the intruder. They found nothing. Fujita climbed back into the relative safety of the clouds and headed for Melbourne. He used a tactic of dropping down out of the clouds every now and then to take observations, and then climbing into the clouds for safety. His unexpected descent above RAAF Laverton had made him very nervous indeed. The crews of the 4 anti-aircraft guns at Williamstown, beside the rifle range, were in the middle of a routine inspection of their guns when the telescope operator spotted the aircraft, identifying it as Japanese. The lieutenant in charge of the gun battery did not give the order to fire. Instead, he got on the phone to headquarters to obtain permission. By that time, it was too late. Fujita turned right and headed towards Port Phillip Bay. Fujita continued his charmed journey across Melbourne at a height of 300 metres, obtaining a bird's eye view of the Yarra River, the central business district of Melbourne, and the docks at the mouth of the Yarra River. He then circled over Port Melbourne, South Melbourne and Williamstown to get a better view of the factories and the industrial infrastructure in the area. A night shift worker from the Dunlop tyre factory first noticed the plane circling over his workplace on his way home. Alarmed at this sight, he rushed into his home and called out to his wife, "Don't turn on the lights! There's a plane outside. It's been flying over Dunlops and I don't know what it is." They both pulled their 2 daughters out of bed and they ran outside. It came right over the top of them, flying low and slow. It was heading towards the bay, and they could clearly see the rising sun emblems on the aircraft. Fujita continued southwards over St Kilda, Brighton and Sandringham. He then turned towards Frankston. Okuda, with the canopy back, spotted 19 vessels anchored in the harbour through his binoculars. He also spotted 6 warships headed in single file towards the port of Melbourne. Fujita crossed the shoreline again near Dramana and continued on towards Cape Schanck, where he was able to re-establish his position via the Cape Schanck lighthouse. He then set a direct 175-kilometre course for the Cape Wickham lighthouse. He spotted the submarine 6 nautical miles east of the lighthouse. Fujita and the crew of the Submarine were concerned that the large vessel would be sighted by the lighthouse keepers at the Cape Wickham Lighthouse. Little did they know that downsizing was alive and well in the 1940s. The superintendent and his 3 assistants had been withdrawn back in 1918. Despite this, Fujita reported sighting 3 or 4 men dressed in white running around the lighthouse. He was sure they had been spotted. The aircraft landed and was disassembled, and as it was being stowed aboard submarine I-25, they sped away from the area doing 14 knots.